Too many who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. Be in 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The amazing spider talk, the amazing spider talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the amazing spider talk.
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gvozden, and I'm the founder and editor of SuperiorSpiderTalk.com.
And I'm mischievous Mark Ginocchio, the founder of the Chasing Amazing blog and author of 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die.
Well, thanks, Mark, for peeling yourself away from your SNES Classic. Is it the SNES Classic or the SNES Classic?
Well, or is it the SNES Mini?
Oh, well, I mean, whatever kind of thing you want to invent, go for it.
I don't know. Well, I've seen it referred to as the Classic and the Mini Classic, and I don't know.
Well, either way, thank you for pulling yourself away from your 1990s entertainment and joining us on the show today. Yes, thank you as well, listeners at home, for joining us for what is the 8th episode of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. That's two-thirds of the way through this season. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, this specific one, and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans and collectors as we look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture.
Yeah, Dan, and as I go and relive the 90s with my video games, you and I are actually going to go relive the days before video games in this season of All New Amazing Spider Talk, because that's why we're looking at the Stan Lee and Steve Ditko creative run. I mean, the 60s, there weren't video games then, right? There wasn't even Pong then, right?
No. How did they get through their day?
I don't know. I mean, at least they had their smartphones, right?
And they had some of the best comics ever.
Exactly. Well, last time around, we talked about everyone's favorite curmudgeon, the Papa J. Jonah Jameson himself. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more, I guess, thematically. We're going to be talking about Spider-Man's role as a street-fighting superhero and why exactly he was determined to be a friendly neighborhood hero.
That sounds great, Mark. And like always, we like to tell you where you can keep up with books that we're talking about. And for this episode, like most of our episodes, we're going to be talking about the entire Steve Ditko and Stan Lee run on the title, and probably a bunch of other comics too, all the way up to modern day. But we're also going to have a special focus in this episode on Amazing Spider-Man issues 26 and 27. That would be the Crime Master Green Goblin storyline. And to that point, if you want to read along, you can read the whole run just about anywhere, print, digital, or as part of Marvel's Unlimited service. So sit tight, grab more wheat cakes, because you can never get enough of them, right, Mark?
That's true.
And prepare yourself for Street Fightin' Spider-Man.
Because that's actually the era of Spider-Man that I started reading the character. I started reading Spider-Man with, I think, issue 6 or 7. And the first real focused multi-part story was the Crime Master story.
Sure.
That was, I think, issues like 13, 15, something like that, somewhere in there. And I loved it. You know, I mean, I loved the aspect of the kind of Dick Tracy aspect to some of Spider-Man's villains. And when I came onto the book in the early 70s, the character was still pretty down to earth. You know, it hadn't really fought any truly enormously superpowered villains. I think the highest, his biggest, most powerful characters that he fought were people like Doc Ock and Sandman. Maybe Sandman had the biggest powers, that he had to fight. So when John and I were talking over stories to do, we both talked about the idea of doing Dick Tracy type villains.
Alrighty, Dan. So we're talking about Spider-Man being a street-level hero. I guess before we get too much into the details of this, we should kind of define exactly what we're talking about. Those of you reading along in 100 Things Spider-Man should know and do before they die. We actually have a chapter called Street Fighting Spider-Man. I don't know where we get these titles for the podcast and the book from, Dan. I mean, it's almost like they're kind of synergistic or something, right?
You're one never to miss a chance to plug. So
that's true. Merchandising.
Spider Talk the Flamethrower.
Well, yeah. I mean, we're not talking about Saget and M. Bison here. We're talking, of course, about Spider-Man and his penchant for in the early days, but I mean, throughout the course of the character's history of being more of a kind of street level, lower level hero. The Avengers, the Fantastic Four, Doctor Strange, they're having battles on either the cosmic level or in space or, world dominating threats like Thanos and Doctor Doom. And Spider-Man, on the other hand, is someone who's dealing more with kind of your rank and file pickpockets and burglars. I mean, his original enemy that helped create Spider-Man, of course, was the Burglar. No name needed, although he did get a name later, but that's not the point.
As our listeners were apt to tell us.
Exactly.
Thank you, listeners.
And I mean, and even the villains, the super villains that Spider-Man fights, I mean, with a few notable exceptions, I mean, they're mostly normal guys who got extraordinary powers, but like their focus and their threat level is still kind of very keyed in on New York and Spider-Man and that universe, not so much kind of the bigger picture. And this was very intentional. Stan Lee, of course, created the phrase "friendly neighborhood Spider-Man," but in my research for the book, Dan, really turned out to be Steve Ditko, who was really kind of repetitively hitting this nail on the head about what he kept referring to as Peter and Spider-Man living and operating within a quote-unquote teenager's world. And we talked about this, I think, in a few earlier episodes, too. I mean, it's this idea of, if you're going to have the superhero be so distinct by being young and a teenager, you really need to keep playing with that. So rather than have Spider-Man fighting these global or intergalactic threats, it kind of felt more personal if he was fighting things on a smaller level. And Ditko would constantly kind of push back on Stan when Stan kind of wanted to go bigger, more grandiose. I mean, even the very first issue of Amazing Spider-Man, when Spider-Man goes to save John Jameson's space shuttle, apparently Ditko was very unhappy with that story, thought it was ridiculous, then thought it was ridiculous when the terrible Tinkerer was an alien in the second story.
And you can see a quick pivot away from those stories afterwards.
Yeah, and it's especially notable again after issue of starting with Amazing Spider-Man number 10, which is when, for all intents and purposes, Lee was kind of delegated to just writing dialogue, and Ditko was plotting and drawing all of Amazing Spider-Man. And of course, issue 10 was the Enforcers, the first appearance of Fancy Dan, Ox, and who am I forgetting here? Montana. There we go. three gangsters. And they would be used a lot. I mean, the enforcers were kind of a recurring, not that they were considered major threats, but that was almost kind of the point. I mean, Spider-Man was able to more or less dispatch them easily, but, they were kind of this constant street level thorn in his side. And they would, even when a more superpowered villain would come into it, like the Green Goblin or Doc Ock or Sandman. I mean, the enforcers were just kind of there to annoy Spider-Man. And we talk about issues 26 and 27 here because I kind of feel like that's almost like kind of the culmination of the street level epic. I mean, what do you think about this? I mean, this is not news to you. We talk about this a lot over the course of the history of this show, right? These kinds of smaller stories for Spider-Man.
Yeah, I mean, and we also talk about how much we loved Brand New Day, which had a specific focus on this kind of street level, version of the character, and I think this also ties into kind of like the overwhelming presence of New York City as a location for Spider-Man stories. All these things kind of feed together. I like Spider-Man best when he's operating this way, but there's something I've never really been able to put my finger on regarding Spider-Man and his street level, I guess, role, which is less pronounced in these books. The problem I'm discussing is that, like, there are other street level characters. Like, I would put, like, basically all the members of the Defenders, from Luke Cage to Daredevil to Danny Rand, etc., etc. They are also street level characters, but there's something about Spider-Man that, like, puts him not in their world. Like, they often lump him in. Like, I was thinking about the what was that story recently? Shadowland, that, where Spider-Man was incorporated to fight the evil Daredevil with everybody as though he was part of that world, and maybe it's because modern stories have had him less involved in street fighting, he felt like a little bit of an outsider there. And I feel like there's something about the character that places him as a street level character, but still kind of outside the realms of those other guys. And maybe it's just the very fact that he can, like, essentially fly with his webbing, that, like, puts him just up in the sky. Like, he's street level, but he's not. That puts him out of that realm. Do you see him in the same realm as those characters, or is it like a different distinction of street level?
No, it's you know what it is. It's, I think that he is in a different realm because, I mean, certainly when compared to, like, Daredevil, for example, because, like, yes, Daredevil has, like, heightened senses. But it's not like he's as strong as Spider-Man or as fast as Spider-Man or can, not fly, but, move as kind of aerodynamically as Spider-Man. You know what I mean? Like, it's he's still really grounded by physics and reality. I mean, Luke Cage is a little different, but, he's kind of a hard one to peg. I mean, like, Luke Cage is bulletproof. I mean, and Luke Cage is also, as much as he's been a street level, I mean, he was also kind of a key part of the Avengers in recent years, which then again, so is Spider-Man, which is a whole other thing. Like, did Spider-Man really, does he belong on the Avengers? But I do agree with you. There's kind of a distinction. I think the distinction with Spider-Man is almost that he has the powers and the capabilities to be more than a street level hero, but for various reasons that I think are just inherent to who the character is, and of course the groundwork laid here by Stan and Steve, I feel that he's most familiar at the street level versus the cosmic level. I mean, he tries out for the Fantastic Four in the first issue and doesn't get on it because he's an outcast. He's he doesn't belong with those heroes. he doesn't belong with the Avengers when he does that tryout there. Like he always, either because of his ego or his own attitude or the Parker luck, he always finds himself on his own, and that kind of like reflects more on the street level, fighting these more kind of lonelier, solitary personal villains versus the Avengers or the Fantastic Four.
But like going off what you said, I could see, those ideas as a reasoning for why Ditko and Lee would have this disagreement essentially about how to use the character, because Lee could very well see him as this very powerful guy who could fight Doctor Doom in issue 5, whereas Ditko, was very locked into this whole teenager thing, which to me is like probably the source for why they decided to take the character this route. We could add on a bunch of stuff in the future as to what would eventually come that would lock him into this role, whether it's like his lack of money and his own kind of scatterbrainness and the Parker luck as that would develop. But it seems to me from the very beginning the reason we went down this route is because he's a teenager and kind of a hothead and so on and so forth, that he almost just, his own attitude excludes him from being a part of these kind of battles. But he certainly would eventually, in Secret Wars go and, fight, like with the Beyonder and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, also remember, just to your point too, like in that, I think we talked about this during the Powers and Abilities episode. I mean, in that first issue of Amazing Spider-Man Annual, when they're kind of talking about Spider-Man's power vis-a-vis the rest of the Marvel superhero universe, I mean, he's basically just a notch below of like the Hulk and Thor at that point in history, So like he's considered very powerful,
right.
Like he's not. So yeah, it's these other traits that kind of bring him down. It's not his abilities or powers that bring him down. It's the personality and the character quirks.
Well, let's talk about the pros and cons of this approach to the character. Like, what do we think is gained by them deciding to do this with the character, and perhaps what is lost by taking the character this route? Like, I think, like in my mind, the longer that this run went on, the more handcuffed it seems that they must have felt to keep the character at this level, like until he's literally fighting a bad guy named Joe. You know what I mean? Like they lean both ways, what's gained and what's lost by it. So like, what do we think are the pros of what is special about keeping Spider-Man at the street level?
Well, certainly in the context of the Lee Ditko run and this point in history in comics, I mean, what the biggest pro is, this really distinguishes Spider-Man from pretty much every other superhero save maybe Batman in comics, right? I mean, like, everyone else is fighting aliens and invasions and like big cosmic threats that can vaporize the planet, and Spider-Man is busy dealing with a guy with mechanical arms that wants to be rich, or I mean, or a guy who gets the power of electricity and just wants to rob banks, Like, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, like, these villains themselves, they never really they don't take their powers to the next level either. And I think by making him so distinct, it's that age-old thing we talk about with Spider-Man all the time. It makes him more relatable. I mean, it's like, not only is he a teenager in a world of adults, but like he's a teenager. It continues that narrative of, if Spider-Man's just fighting a bank robber, anybody can be that Spider-Man. Anybody could be, if anybody who had the power could stop a bank robber. Not everybody can fight an alien, because those aliens don't exist.
Or travel back in time and pose as Blackbeard the pirate.
Exactly. So that's, to me, it's what helped distinguish Spider-Man, and obviously it worked. I mean, like, Spider-Man is, up until a few years ago when it became Iron Man, and he's Marvel's mascot. He's their flagship hero, but it certainly sets up a number of cons. I mean, you mentioned some of the lamer villains, and like you said, like that seemed to be a byproduct of them being handcuffed, right?
Yeah, I just wonder how much that is Ditko really leaning into this. Like, the villains aren't, like, I think there was a certain point where he decided the villains are also going to be like this. Like, there was always something fantastical about Spider-Man's villains, even if they were street level, like, kind of like thugs that were elevated to a certain point. But then there seems to be a point where Ditko just decided he's only going to be fighting thugs. Like, and you got things like the Looter and the Cat and Joe. Sorry to harp on Joe.
It's okay.
That would be Ditko's final issue. I actually like that issue.
Right.
But I think it's probably more forgettable for most people. But I just wonder if they kind of leaned a little too far into that, to the point that it was like, oh, this is just like a kind of a crime novel at some point with like a little bit of elevated stuff.
It's like Spider-Man meets Raymond Chandler. I mean, yeah, and kind of to that point, we'll talk about some of this more specifically when we talk about 26 and 27. But like, I think it also kind of like, by having so many kind of dime a dozen villains, it kind of like set up this narrative where things were just too real and mundane and too much based on reality, because like, yes, it set Spider-Man apart, but meanwhile, like, Kirby over on Fantastic Four is just doing mind-blowing stuff, utilizing like, the negative zone and time travel and these like creative villains, and it's like, it's really like, if you ever go back and read the Kirby Lee Fantastic Four run, I mean, it's mind-blowing stuff, because it's just like, it's got that Marvel flair of the characters all feel more grounded in reality because they're fighting with each other, they have real world problems, but meets this like outer limit kind of mind-bending stuff that Kirby is putting out there in terms of his world building and his visuals and his villains and whatnot. And it's like, it's just really exciting. Like, oh man, this is I'm opening up this comic and I'm getting transported to another universe, and that's amazing. Whereas, Spider-Man, it's like, for example, in issue 27 with the Crime Master, it's like, oh, sometimes the butler did do it. You know what I mean? Like, oh, wow. Why don't you really try to excite me there, Ditko? I mean, like, yeah, we get it. Like, sometimes it is the butler, but sometimes it is a killer cosmic deity like Galactus who's going to, like, end civilization as we know it.
It's funny that reveal comes from the same guy who drew Doctor Strange. Right. He clearly had this very almost Kirby-esque side to him where he wanted to do crazy things, but he knew that Spider-Man was not the place he wanted to do them.
Yeah. And that was the thing. Once Ditko kind of set his mind to what he wanted something to be, he just would not bend from it, Like, he saw compromises like, failure.
Well, do you want to talk about issues 26 and 27?
Yeah, I mean, we did, I think, talk about this in detail some time ago on this podcast, but just in the context of, I think, probably talking about like Goblin Nation or something way back in the day. But I think it's worth revisiting, and I think it's especially as it relates to this topic, because I really do feel this is kind of like the quintessential street level Spider-Man story. I mean, I think we had when Jerry Conway, one of the times Jerry Conway was on the show, when he was talking about Spiral, he mentioned how this story kind of influenced him as a writer of Spider-Man, and like kind of how this is the world he sees Spider-Man in. I mean, Tom DeFalco has talked about this story. I mean, it's basically it's the triangle of Spider-Man, the Green Goblin, who at this point is still a mystery villain, and then a new mystery villain, the Crime Master, and it's Crime Master and Goblin fighting over criminal turf and who's going to run the underworld, and Spider-Man trying to figure out who, their identities, and they're trying to figure out Spider-Man identities. So it's like, they're all going after each other, and they're all going after each other very personally, which creates this high level of drama. But really the prize to be won is just, I guess, ruling the criminal underworld of New York. It's nothing bigger or higher than that. Not that that's a small thing, but no one is looking for, world domination. It's just, I want to run the streets, and that's, and I mean, and there are other elements to it too. What are some of the things that stick out to you in this story for you that speak to the street level theme?
Well, I was thinking to myself about this story. Is this the first time that we really saw the gang element come into Spider-Man? I mean, of course, there was obviously like the enforcers and stuff,
but the circus of crime,
But like, have we ever seen like a large group of nondescript thugs, like kind of being utilized in the pages of Spider-Man? I mean, I'm thinking now and back during like the Goblin Nation story and things like that, where like you have all these different costumed rival gangs in the pages of Spider-Man, which is an idea that really ebbs and flows through the history of the character. Daredevil seems to kind of really operate in this space more than Spider-Man now. But like this story to me really established that like, even before Master Planner, when we would get the Dr. Octopus, gang, this was the first time that we really saw like a full on, gang war of sorts, where different people would attach themselves to these villains, and the villains would take a role from being a one-on-one fight to being a more like larger force in Spider-Man's world. And that's an interesting concept that has reappeared throughout the series every now and again. And to me, this is like the real birth of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also important that this series also, with the Green Goblin is kind of still being established as like one of Spider-Man's heavy hitters in terms of villains. And, I think it's interesting that the Green Goblin's priority is criminal dominance. It's not, like it's the fact that is of such importance to this villain that is being viewed as an important villain for Spider-Man. I think that again kind of just brings this all home. But yeah, I mean, without having these kind of like rank and file thugs being shown in these two comics, like I don't know if you ever have like, the Fisk family and the Maggia family and there's so many of them.
Every week there's a new one.
Yeah. Mr. Negative and
the White Dragon had one at some point.
Yep. I mean, it's everyone's had a piece. So yeah, but like it's there's just so many nameless thugs in this comic, and kind of also plays to, and we were referring to it just a few minutes ago about Ditko's obsession with villains being just regular people, which has mixed results, right?
Yeah. I would be curious to see how people responded to this reveal of the Crime Master at the end of this story back in the day. I'm sure I could go back and read the letters pages. But, I mean, it's an interesting idea that kind of lands with a thud in the pages of this issue, because you're really hyped up to find out who this guy is. And ultimately, we never really do we?
No. I mean...
Was there ever a name put on this guy?
No, I don't think so.
He just remains a nobody.
Yeah. And it's funny because, like, you know, I often wonder if that reveal is, I mean, yes, it plays to the street level sensibilities, but that also just kind of plays to Ditko's ideology of, like, almost like, you know, what, you expect something more grandiose than that? That's not what I'm here to do. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, you know, like, don't be such a moocher about these stories. You know what I mean? Like, you know, he even says, like, you know, it's not up to him to heighten the story to unrealistic levels, you know, like, that's not, you know, then you shouldn't be reading this comic if that's what you're looking for. And it just seems very much like, eat your vegetables, you brats, you know what I mean? Like,
what do you think that reveal means for Spider-Man as a street level character? Like, would that reveal ultimately lock him into any kind of position?
What do you mean?
Like, does that reveal become emblematic of the series moving forward? Like, do you think that nobody reveal becomes a long-lasting part of Spider-Man's DNA? Or is the Green Goblin's, like, reveal more indicative of the kind of threat Spider-Man would face moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, like, again, go back in the time machine. I mean, when they would reveal who the Green Goblin is a handful of issues later, I mean, okay, Norman Osborn was a little bit closer to Spider-Man, but he had only really been introduced by name a few issues earlier, and Harry Osborn had only been introduced a few issues before that. And it wasn't like Peter and Harry were bosom buddies at that point. You know what I mean? Yeah. They were just kind of like schoolmates. So again, it like kind of like continued this narrative of, you know, okay, this is just somebody, you know, like, it's not, you know, like, I think in another comic book series that's not Spider-Man that kind of set these ground rules of, you know, really trying to be nitty gritty reality. I mean, you know, the Crime Master would have been J. Jonah Jameson. And there was even people guessing, like, the Green Goblin they thought was Jameson. You know?
Yeah, you could read it in the letters pages.
Yeah. Or if you don't want to say Jameson, I mean, it was, I don't know, like
Ned Leeds,
or yeah. Well, that would come later.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves. With
No. But yeah, I mean, like, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, you know, when has in the history, and you know, we'll talk obviously about the big picture going forward, and maybe we can use this to go into it. But I mean, like, when in the history of Spider-Man has the reveal of a secret character or a villain really been a mind-blowing reveal?
Norman Osborn, maybe Menace.
Yeah, I mean,
the eventual reveal of the Hobgoblin.
Right, but Roderick Kingsley was just a guy.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, having it be Ned Leeds was more kind of the traditional comic book vein, you know, with the Hobgoblin. Like, oh, this guy that's been kind of, you know, who's been very much involved in Spider-Man's supporting universe for years, and like, oh my goodness, now how did he just become a supervillain out of nowhere, you know? Whereas Roderick Kingsley, who was Roderick Kingsley? I mean, that was the whole point. That's why, what's his name? DeFalco dismissed it. Who cares? What do you mean he's got an evil twin? Not a twin.
So maybe you know, dismissing it outright and thinking, oh, the Green Goblin was more indicative of what would come. Really, the nobody is kind of the bread and butter of Spider-Man.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's like, I feel like, you know, it's kind of become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's very rare that it's something more than what it is. I mean, okay, the Man in Red, you could say, that was kind of very atypical of a Spider-Man reveal, being Ben Reilly, right?
That was genuinely surprising.
Yeah.
Also because it didn't really make sense in the story. But
right.
That's a whole other thing.
Well, I was about to say, I mean, and at the same token, it's kind of like, do these more shocking reveals that are atypical, I mean, do they actually really benefit the story, you know?
Or how often are they actually pulled off in comics?
Right. Yeah. I mean, but yet we consumers of comics seem to want these shocking reveals, and then we don't like them.
I mean, I think the only one that I've genuinely been surprised by in the pages of Spider-Man was the reveal in 698 in Superior. That was genuinely shocking.
Yes.
That's very interesting. I would have walked into this conversation saying the Green Goblin is the prototype, but really, I think it's the Crime Master. I would never have said that.
Yeah. So there we go.
It's that guy over there. That's who it is.
It's just the guy. It could be the guy you're sitting on the train with, going to work with, Dan. He could be the. I know you drive now, right?
I do, yeah. No, I don't think it's ever been someone without a name again, like this guy. They've always been some minor character, and just like in any Batman story, it's the guy you introduced at the beginning of the story turns out to be Hush, or any number of these secret mystery Batman villains that are just the new guy in Batman's life.
Right.
It's the same is true with Spider-Man.
Right. I mean, well, that was even, again, going back to DeFalco kind of dismissing Roderick Kingsley. It was, he felt that introducing that Roderick Kingsley had a brother that looked like him was not fair game at, the way the story had been, pitched to that point in the comics.
And really, that's kind of the only way around it. Stern kind of had it figured out, is they're going to immediately expect that it's this guy, so there has to be some additional wrinkle to it. We could talk about that, obviously, when we get to Roger Stern and all the stuff he did. But it is interesting to think about all this stuff. So let's talk about the influence of this kind of street level. We've kind of skirted around this a little bit. Let's talk about this influence of this street level, I guess, framing for Spider-Man on the book going forward post Lee Ditko.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say, well, obviously, even after Ditko left, I mean, with Romita and Lee, they maintain this. I mean, in the pages of Spider-Man, we had the Kingpin was soon introduced, who's the ultimate street level villain.
Right.
And Silvermane is introduced, and, other villains like the Shocker, who's, again, just a crook who's trying to break into bank vaults, like. Who
do you think as a writer best exemplifies this kind of approach to the character within their writing?
I would say Jerry Conway and Tom DeFalco.
Okay.
Are probably the two key ones who have played the most in this world, and I think have also done it the most successfully.
I'd like to add JMS to that list because, he had Peter as a teacher, but also a lot of the struggles that he would deal with like kids who were, homeless or being bullied or any of these other things. And then it would obviously always go into kind of a weird mystical Doctor Strange realm. Even like the big battle in Times Square that would happen with the kind of mindless ones. But the essence of the threat was always street level. So like the victims were street level, but the villains would always be some kind of otherworldly thing. And it was interesting seeing how those worlds clashed. So I think he played with the kind of what it means for Spider-Man to be street level and then go into another hero's role. It's not typical, but I thought it was worth mentioning.
I mean, and under JMS, I mean, the other thing that kind of was key was it was always a personal battle for Peter.
Yeah.
Which I think kind of plays into this theme. It's not about, when there's a threat, it's not important that necessarily that the world is in danger. It's that what's being attacked means a lot to Peter, and he needs to do everything in his power to fight that.
How do you feel like this kind of element surfaced in Jerry Conway's writing? Because in some ways he was very much, while he would introduce radical changes, he kind of was like a shepherd for continuing the book as it had been running for a while.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Jerry Conway created characters like Hammerhead and the Punisher, which are very street level characters. I mean, the Punisher now hangs out with Daredevil more than Spider-Man because, again, Daredevil has seemingly co-opted everything street level about Spider-Man. But again, most of the stories with Jerry, they're focusing more on the lower level, and they're not these huge threats. And then Jerry Conway's later work, I'm not even talking about later work, but his 80s and 90s work with Tombstone and Joe Robbie Robertson and the Daily Bugle, and just kind of focusing on these very these little smaller bits of minutia and character work of normal people, not the heightened people. And I feel like Jerry was more comfortable writing in that plane. I mean, we had a clone story with Jerry, which we can thank him for spawning future clone stories.
Thanks, Jerry.
Yes, I'm sure he prefers that on his record versus killing Gwen Stacy. But also DeFalco too. I mean, we talked about this during our Essential series, and I don't know if you completely agreed with me when I kept saying it, but I always view, even though we're talking about an alien suit, those 6 or 7 issues following DeFalco's debut on 252, where it's him and Friends, and then Rick Leonardi, and then Friends again, where we're dealing with the Rose and the Hobgoblin's back, but the Hobgoblin is trying to advance in the criminal underworld, and then we're meeting Richard Fisk, the Kingpin's son, and it's this very grounded, and we're keying in on the Daily Bugle and what's going on there. I mean, I for what it's worth, the Daily Bugle I feel always plays a key role with the street level elements too. It's I feel like every creator who's had a good handle on street level Spider-Man also has a good handle on the interplay of the Daily Bugle. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that. Although there are they would play with some of these more grander superhero elements, but again, it was always about how out of place Spider-Man was in these roles. I'm thinking about the Firelord issue. You could, in a way, even though it's a cosmic threat, say it's also a street level thing, because it's all about how Firelord is kind of an assault on street level characters that should never be interacting with a guy of this power set. I mean, I think and all the solutions for beating him are something someone at the street level would think of, how do I run him into this building that's about to blow up? It's not like Thor, where it's I'll trap him in some cosmic yada 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 yada.
Yeah.
It's I'm gonna literally take mortar and pestle. I'm gonna bring this building down on top of him.
Yeah. Now, do you feel that, again, kind of to what you were saying with the end of the Ditko Lee run with some of the villains and stuff? I mean, do you feel that going full street level throughout the 70s and 80s has had some adverse effects on the character?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speak for you, Mark, but I feel the 70s and early 80s were amongst the least interesting time to be reading Spider-Man. We just kind of got forgettable rogue after forgettable rogue, and I think it's probably because people locked into this formula for how to do a Spider-Man comic, which is I always attribute to the Electro storyline, where it's some random dude gets some random power and decides to rob a bank, and Spider-Man stops him. And that's kind of the template for years of Spider-Man comics, whether it's a guy who can control whirlwinds or whatever, or a guy who can jump like a kangaroo. I mean, you name it, you know. I feel like we got into that kind of like street level approach a little too hard. People weren't as willing to dream of who the next Doc Ock would be for a while. You
mean having a villain who could hypnotize you with a guitar riff was not groundbreaking, Dan? Yeah. I mean, come on.
I mean, they're almost like entirely forgettable. You know, like they're the people that show up in the bar with no name and get beaten up off panel. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But then at the same time, you could arguably say probably of that era of, you know, characters that we're talking about, probably the best one created is very quintessentially street level, which is Black Cat.
That's true. That's true.
But again, I mean, that's one out of how many that, you know, like you said, I mean, you know, there's the angry former member of NATO who makes cyclones. Mirage, who's not Mysterio.
Yeah. Tarantula.
Yes.
Who I guess kind of had a little bit going for him.
Right. Well, okay, here's mystery villains. Jackal was a good mystery. I feel that was a good reveal.
Okay.
Right? And that's very street level. I mean, you know, he's a mad scientist, but like it's not like, I don't know, he's not like an alchemist or something, or he's not making an infinity gauntlet, you know? Like he's just creating clones of people close to Peter because of his psychosis, you know? Like,
and wearing a green Jackal costume, I guess, just because.
Yeah. Yeah, I always thought it was interesting that, like, Jerry Conway has talked about, in retrospect, he created the Punisher just to kind of be a one-off lackey of the Jackal. Like, he wanted the Jackal to be the main event, and, like, he instantly realized, like, oh, wow, the Punisher is way cooler than the Jackal. Like, crap.
Well, I mean, I've said how I felt about that. I mean, do you share my opinion about the 70s and early 80s? Like, I skip past a lot of it when I do rereads.
I don't disagree with that, but at the same token, like, if you kind of go beyond the pages of Amazing Spider-Man, the 70s there also was a lot of far out stuff going on, especially like a Marvel team up, which I know you haven't really read, cover to cover, so to speak, but like, you know, like he's teaming up with the Guardians of the Galaxy and Warlock, and like he's traveling in time with Moondragon and fighting Kang and stuff like that. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on in the 70s. Probably also a lot of drugs too. So, but I mean, I think specifically when he was operating within the street level realm during that era, there were certainly more misses than hits. I mean, there were a couple of hits of the street levels. Like I would say, like the longest 100 yards, which we talked about when we were eulogizing Len Wein recently. I mean, like to me, that's a great street level story about a guy who's in over his head with some crooks. You know what I mean? And Spider-Man trying to help him, but that's just one story. I mean, for every 100 longest yards, there's like 8 cyclones and mirages and hypno hustlers and mindworm.
Yeah. So like there's the 70s and 80s that were particularly street level, and I guess you could probably say some of the 90s. I mean, like the Clone Saga was a very personal tale for the most part. But I think the next time we really got back to this kind of real focus on this was the Brand New Day era, which we've publicly been on the record as being one of the few champions of that era.
Right. Well, I think most people like those stories. They just don't like what spawned them. But that's neither here nor there.
And the first few years of it were kind of rough.
Yes. But it's interesting in that, you know, I feel like we go through these cyclical patterns with Spider-Man where, you know, we'll have a big chunk of time where he gets away from these street level routes, and then like there's like this adamant no, we have to bring him back. We have to bring him back. I mean, like, I know you were talking about during like the JMS run that there was, like these kind of like smaller nuanced elements, street level elements to it. But I mean, there also was a lot of like really high minded mystical cosmic stuff. And then of course, which is capped off with him interacting with the devil.
Right.
Which is the opposite of street level.
I don't like to credit JMS with that.
I know, but I'm saying, but at the same token, like Brand New Day was, whether you put your hand on the Bible of the what is it, Brevoort's manifesto or not. But it's about bringing Spider-Man back to his roots, and his roots being those street level roots, and meanwhile, one of the main architects of Brand New Day, Dan Slott, I feel like in recent years has gotten very far away from the street level, right?
I mean, that seemed to be from day one his MO. Like, Big Time was about getting him away. Like, literally, it's in the title. It's getting him away from that. And as time has progressed, we've swung as far away from it, I think, as we've ever gotten with the character.
Yeah. I mean, even the Clone Conspiracy, which has the elements of a personal story a la the first Clone Saga. I mean, the ultimate threat there is to the world, right? I mean,
right.
it's an apocalypse, and they're jumping through different multiverses to get there. So it's kind of funny how like like a yo-yo, it always comes back up, to street level.
Yeah, right. And the Legacy, the entire pitch of Legacy isn't even really something that special. Like, I'm not like, it's just saying, oh, we're bringing him back to his roots. Like, that's literally the pitch.
Yeah, it's Peter Parker menace.
So do you think we're ever going to get back to Spider-Man fighting guys like the Enforcers or the Crime Master anymore? I mean, like, specifically that low level where they're just gangsters. Is that not in his territory anymore? Like, is that a Daredevil thing that Spider-Man is to remain away from? Like, will people be excited to read a book where it is Spider-Man versus a gangster? I mean, we got Spiral, but even then, that was super villains to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, no, we probably won't because, I mean, for many reasons, but, you kind of hit upon them all in your preface to that question. I mean, you have Daredevil for that now. You have a Defenders book, which is based on the Netflix series, which again is very street level.
Miles Morales.
So it's kind of like, what we were saying way back at the beginning of the episode, like Spider-Man kind of is he's still a notch above, even if people try to always kind of bring him back to that level. And it's like, I feel like he's been at a notch above for far too long to like kind of bring him back down all the way. So I would be shocked to see him do that. I mean, even if it is a gang, like a Mr. Negative is certainly like a street level villain, but there's a higher element to him, right?
Yeah. And we don't even really often see the Kingpin in the pages of Spider-Man anymore.
Right. Unless you're talking about Chip Zdarsky and Kubert's Spider-Man with a little bit of Kingpin in there. So.
But even then, the Tinkerer had to have this giant robot,
right?
Thing. Yeah.
Yes. I know.
The less said about that, the better.
Okay. I mean, do you think it's a bad thing that we won't get back there? I mean, you kind of just said it. Like, would people be excited by it? I don't know if they would be. I think we've been trained to not look for that now.
I think there have been enough stories that have put Spider-Man like in a higher category that are beloved that like it will be hard for people to adjust their mindset about it. But I mean, even the Kraven story that we got, the great Kraven's Last Hunt like redo, was and mystical elements and all this stuff involved in it. Instead of just a guy that was kind of crazy and a jungle man. You know, like, could you have another Kraven story where Spider-Man fights against this, like, jungle, you know, trained hunter guy? We haven't seen him fight Kraven in over 100 issues. Like, have we even boxed out some villains?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems like when we bring those villains back now, it's usually in a reduced role. Like, Electro really isn't a main event anymore. You know, like he's kind of brought in as an accessory. Vulture kind of comes and goes, but like we haven't had like a hardcore, really like focused Vulture story. It's always, you know, he shows up for an issue or two and causes trouble and then it goes away. So I'd say no.
I mean, I hold out hope. I think any good writer could come in and get us excited about that stuff again. And maybe Legacy will prove that that's the direction they want to head. But, I mean, we're already getting like a big Venom crossover, and who knows what is come down the pike. But, yeah, I miss it, to be honest. But I can understand why we've moved past it. Yeah, I think it's about time we wrap the show up. This has been a fun conversation.
Definitely. So thanks for joining us for our 8th episode of the first season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. Dan, our next episode is going to be out in about 2 weeks. We're thinking October 25th. And what's the title for that show?
Yeah, it's going to be one actually I've been really excited to do ever since we started doing the show, and it's going to be called Ditko Shrugged. We're going to be talking about Ditko's influence on the creation of Spider-Man and also how his kind of Randian, objectivist ideas and philosophies left their mark on the character. Think of this as the companion piece to our Stan Lee episode.
Yeah, and hopefully we maybe like in the Stan Lee episode we might have some additional voices on that. That's to be announced. Also, for our Patreon subscribers, be sure to check out our Patreon page and your podcast feed for this week's bonus episode. Last week, Dan and I reviewed Amazing Spider-Man Volume 4, number 32, the end of Volume 4 on the title. This week, we're going to be discussing Marvel Legacy number 1, the comic that launched Marvel Legacy Initiative and intends to bring Marvel back to its roots, its street-level roots, maybe.
We'll see.
Right?
I mean, judging by that comic, I don't think so. Like, Celestials were hanging out in that comic.
That's true. That's true. Remember, just for $3.99 a month, the price of a new comic, you'll get access to our exclusive new issue reviews, Swarm, B-Books, mailbags, and all that other fun stuff in your off weeks. And then for $10 or more a month, you'll be sent exclusive commissioned artwork in the mail every 6 months. Dan, that sounds great. Where can we find you on the social medias?
Yeah, I'm always hanging out on Twitter at Sup Spider Talk, promoting all the awesome work that's being done over on SuperiorSpiderTalk.com, and just talking about my feelings about comics and things in general. I also am on Twitter at my personal account at Dan Gvozden. That's more my movie-oriented account, where you can hear all my reviews about the latest movies that are hitting theaters. This week, Blade Runner 2049. I'll have a lot to say about that movie. Mark, what about you? Where can we find you on the internet?
All right, Dan. Well, of course, you can find me on Twitter at Chasing ASM Blog. And I think I'm going to, by the time some people listen to this, there'll probably be a new issue of Amazing Spider-Man, the Legacy debut. So that'll be up on SuperiorSpiderTalk.com. Eventually, I'll write a Chasing Amazing blog again. I got away from that after kind of getting back into it. So forgive me for that. And, of course, the book, 100 Things Spider-Man Fans should know and do before they die, through TriumphBooks.com and all their major retailers. Haven't gotten any new reviews on any sites lately, Dan, like on Amazon or Goodreads or anything. And I know that there are some people out there who are just been getting the books in because you've been tweeting at me or sending me stuff on Facebook. So I'm just going to say, no pressure. But if you read the book and you have something to say about it, please just leave me a review because it helps grow the audience for the book. So thanks so much.
Awesome. Well, Mark, before we completely take off here, I know you're doing marathon training, so I'm sure you've got another 20 miles to go run now that the show is done. I think we should leave it on a valuable lesson for our listeners to take home with them. And I know that you have a lesson that's near and dear to your street-level heart.
Yeah, when I'm out there on the road pounding the pavement for 20 miles, I always think to myself, with great podcasts must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.